Good morning, everyone. Sincere welcome to our event, Engaging the Private Sector to Advance the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. This has been a happy partnership with our Secure Future to engage the private sector as a potential partner in implementing the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. We have a very engaging session planned for you all today. We will have presentations by the WIIS lead researcher on this project, Dr. Karin Johnston, and Natasha Garcha, Senior Director of Sustainable Finance at the Impact Investment Exchange, who was also a participant in our research study. After these presentations, we have a few questions for you all, our audience, mostly centered on building a business case and tools that can integrate WPS principles into your sector or organization. With that, I would like now to turn to Sahana Dharmapuri, Vice President at Our Secure Future, to open the session with welcoming remarks. Sahana, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to everyone for joining us here. I'm Sahana Dharmapuri. I'm the Vice President of Our Secure Future. We are part of a private family philanthropy, and we focus 100% on women, peace, and security and implementing women, peace, and security. And we are really delighted to be in partnership with WIIS on this project, and Lauren and Karin and the whole team over at WIIS and your membership, because this is a really critical project, I think, and especially today with everything that's been changing in our sector. One of the things we realized for quite a long time before all of the changes in 2025 in DC, that the private sector has been really a missing stakeholder in our conversations about women, peace, and security, and we really need to do more to engage with the private sector as a whole, and particularly women in the private sector as a key stakeholder in peace and security discussions and in advancing women, peace, and security. So, this is one of our building on our attempts over the last several years of engaging more with the private sector. And I think WIIS, the WIIS team and Karin has really done a phenomenal job in the surveys and the interviews and revealing some of the entry points and also some of the challenges. And I think that's going to make for a really exciting discussion. And I will say, women do represent one of the largest emerging markets globally, and women contribute a lot to stabilizing economies and actually advancing security. And I think engaging the private sector to help us do this better and understanding their role in it is going to really make the whole women, peace, and security agenda move forward much stronger and much better. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm going to hand the floor back to Lauren or our Karin, our first speaker.
Thank you, Sahana. By way of introduction to Karin's presentation, I did want to say that I'm looking at the participant list, and many of you in the audience participated in our research study, exploring the opportunities to advance the WPS agenda in the private sector. So Dr. Karin Johnston, WIIS's Director of Development, will now provide the main findings for the study to which you all contributed to. So thank you. Over to you, Karin.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you, Sahana, also for your remarks and for your support of the work that we've done. It was something that we are beginning to understand more of and better of, the connection between the private sector and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. And I was so thankful for all of your participation, for all of the interviewees and those people who also took the respondents for the survey. So we have some really interesting things to talk about, and I'm looking forward also to our discussion afterwards. So if we can move to the slide for our agenda, and we'll start. So what we have focused on was trying to understand why women, peace, and security in the private sector. We wanted to answer that question, and we'll go into some of the details. We out of that question, sort of how do we understand this? How do we move forward on integrating women, peace, and security better in the private sector? We developed the program and the project, the methodology, and we'll talk about the findings from that. And the most important thing, I think, out of this whole process is trying to understand how to bring a business case to the private sector participants and actors on the advantages of integrating women, peace, and security principles into their business case. And then we'll close with some of the recommendations, and we'll try to look forward and point out some of the questions that we hope will be answered in the round afterwards. So next slide, please. So the question we had was what WPS in the private sector, right? We wanted to look at the principles of WPS and the dynamics inside the private sector. And so just for references, again, many of you already know, but the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is a global policy framework that focuses on recognizing and strengthening the role of women in peace and security efforts. It had its 25th anniversary last year, the UN Security Council 1325, in which the agenda is anchored, and it's anchored on, again, these four principles that have been core to our understanding of how we implement WPS over the last 25 years and moving forward. Participation, ensuring women's equal and meaningful involvement in conflict prevention, peace negotiations, the protection aspect that safeguards the rights, the physical safety, the health of women and girls, particularly against conflict-related violence. Prevention integrates gender perspectives to prevent conflict in all forms of violence against women. And finally, the relief and recovery pillar, which addresses the specific needs and agency of women during and after crises, emphasizing their access to justice, to relief, and to resources. And so over time, the implementation of WPS broadened in the sense that it moved beyond just peacekeeping or peace negotiations to face the challenges that we have today, shifting world with climate change, forced migration, the impact of technology, cyber, disinformation on women, boys, girls, men. And so because of these peace building and peacekeeping and conflict related issues, governments and civil society groups were really at the fore and core of the implementation of WPS. And it left out, in some ways, the private sector, which has not traditionally been viewed as a key actor in the peace and security space. And so with those core principles and values of WPS, which we know, right, infuse every aspect of our society. It's WPS is a whole of society approach to peace and security, and thus relevant, extremely relevant to all of these emerging issues that weren't necessarily there in full 25 years ago. And so it means then that it is equally relevant and vital in the private sector. And we know, again, that studies show the value added of greater representation of women in the business sector, right? A diverse workplace, it's innovative, better decision-making processes. Women contribute to a better work environment. So all of these studies on sort of women in the workplace and in the business sector show that there are advantages. And yet, as we all know again as well, women are underrepresented in the private sector, businesses, tech fields. So despite the potential, we see obstacles as well as benefits. And that was the core sort of movement towards understanding what this project was going to be and how we approached it. So we assumed then that active engagement with WPS is also a strategic, operational, and organizational asset for private sector actors. And so with that assertion, that led us to the research question, which we have, which is, what is the rationale for businesses to invest in WPS? And we developed a methodology in which we looked at a scoping study to map the private sector's knowledge of WPS. We conducted key informant interviews with women in 4 business areas. We looked at the legal side of the private sector, the cyber tech, financing and consulting, and in defense. And with the insights drawn from those interviews, we designed a survey questionnaire to learn how WPS is perceived and applied in these different sort of subsectors of the private sector. And our findings do affirm that there's a strong business case to be made for private sector companies that can deliver, right? And so with the knowledge that we acquired from asking the interviewees about, their organization, whether there's a familiarity with WPS, we asked whether they have and can imagine what a strong business case would be for their companies and for the private sector in general. And we tried to ask very specific questions also about the tech, the legal aspects, and cyber for their own sort of sub-sector itself. And so what did we learn? And we learned four, I think, important elements together, both the survey questions and in the key informant interviews. First, we learned, above all, that there is a clear disconnect between awareness of WPS principles that support business strategies and their practical application. While all interviewees felt WPS was valuable to them personally, only 8 out of the 10 interviews reported that their organization, or that their 8 out of the 10 had, 8 out of the 10 interviewers reported that their organizations had very little knowledge, if any, of WPS. So the degree to which we have a challenge of bringing the knowledge of WPS and its relevance to them is pretty high. And so secondly, it means also that WIIS is an underutilized tool, right? With little knowledge of WPS principles, they miss out on the benefits that can accrue to their businesses for implementing it. And thirdly, the incentives and the benefits. The primary challenge is not private sector resistance to adopting WPS principles, the interviewers and the respondents told us, but a lack of translation into operationally relevant tools and frameworks. And they identified all these structural barriers, right, the traditional structural barriers, as one of the most important obstacles to advancing WPS principles. And that's obviously not terribly surprising to all of us. Lack of opportunities and promotional advancement to higher management, fighting deeply entrenched male cultures, especially in manufacturing, sort of business and engineering firms. There remains an absence of standardized WPS frameworks and metrics that could help bring together an awareness of what a business and of the advantages of integrating WPS in a business case. And women, obviously, in terms of representation, are a very small percentage of the business sector. They remain, a minority in tech and cyber firms and financial institutions, and that needs to be addressed as well. And finally, one really important barrier I think that we did discuss was this question of WPS is nice to have until profitability and fiscal spending become tight. And so in the constant sort of business questions about what their bottom line is, what the profitability is, sometimes and often understanding the need for integrating women peace and security frameworks has no resonance with them. And so in terms of benefits, there were a lot of benefits that were talked about in there. Integrating WPS into reputational strategies is a benefit to companies. Building corporate policies that can recruit, train, and retain in terms of giving women opportunities to move to higher management levels in the firm is a distinct advantage. There was one story, an interviewee from the legal sector who said that diverse legal teams have an advantage because all clients are not all white men. And so having firms with that diverse representation for clients makes clients of diverse backgrounds feel more comfortable. And she argued that, in fact, having that diverse team that offers the benefits actually helps in the long run raise revenue for the law firm. And convening power, finally, strategic partnerships are really important for building and leveraging with NGO organizations. They create opportunities for business firms themselves, not just for the NGOs. The private sector has this convening power to bring diverse actors together, collect skills for projects. One expert interviewee gave an example. Her global engineering firm was accused of human rights violations by employing forced labor. And she brought together all sides of the table, both the organizations that were accusing the company and other actors, which led to the firm actually developing strategies to prevent forced labor practices in supply chains. And that led her, in her career, initiate and lead a global response to human slavery issues. So convening powers, strategic partnerships can be a distinct advantage as well. Next slide, please. Again, the core of this is understanding what that operational implementation can be for businesses. And building a business case, as you can see, there were lots of from the survey and from the responses, ways in which our respondents said can be an advantage for businesses in the implementation of WPS. And so, for interview respondents in cyber and tech, it was that WPS objectives are tied to information operations, that is, online harassment, hate mail, cyber-related gender-based violence. That is core to the work, for example, of people who work in open source intelligence domains, in hybrid warfare. The links to WPS and are there. They just have to be brought to the surface, and with that knowledge, right, that sense of building the knowledge about WPS, businesses can be set for building more advantages both to their bottom line and for the quality and the innovation of their staff. And some then our interviews and findings support the assertion that, again, in summary, incorporating the WPS agenda in the private sector requires increasing the visibility of its principles and presenting a business case that provides both an evidence-based rationale and tools for private sector actors and organizations to utilize in their business strategies. And the next slide then, please. For recommendations, we close with this, again, the primary challenge, the lack of translation into these operationally relevant tools. And in the discussions that we had and the respondents, there were any number of very relevant and doable strategies for integrating this into a business case. So one of the strongest findings from the survey was this broad support for standards and certification programs for business firms to incorporate WPS principles, since it is seen as a mechanism to move companies from commitment to implementation. WPS principles have to be embedded in those core strategies. The companies that have, for example, a CSR and ESG frameworks, have sometimes advantages because in many ways the companies have that relationship with the local organizations and communities in which the value attached to these kind of frameworks does give some companies a strategic advantage. Funding digital literacy, training companies on WPS and ethical AI and privacy compliance, all of these recommendations can be utilized for companies. And so moving forward, in the next slide, we look towards how we can apply this, how we close this, the gap. Interviewees and respondents agree that the private sector needs to engage more with the WPS agenda, and that the private sector as a whole lacks that strategy. And what will be important then is to move forward to create those tools to build knowledge and educate private sector entities about that value added in integrating WPS principles. So to argue that it is a business asset, it's not just a nice to have. And so the findings as we move forward confirm that the WPS community also, when we look at this, is uniquely positioned to play that central role in advancing private sector engagement with WPS by helping develop those tools and to train advisory support for companies on applying WPS principles by convening their own convening power private sector investor and policy stakeholders on understanding where the business case can be moved forward for helping their bottom line and for improving also the creativity, innovation, and the skill set that their own company staff have. And by translating WPS principles into business relevant frameworks for them. And given the fact that it isn't just, again, the traditional security aspects that are relevant in our society and what we see in this other, emerging global world order, all of the challenges that we have can be improved, can be made more relevant, and can mitigate a lot of these challenges by implementing WPS principles. And that includes, again, the private sector. And we are all thankful that we've been given the opportunity to try to move forward on this, to understand what the next step could be. And we look forward to you giving us also some ideas, some insights from your own experiences, hopefully in your own businesses and in the private sector, or in understanding how we can merge the WPS principles in a sector that has great need for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I would like now to turn the a very sincere welcome to you, Pay Study, and speaking to as you pointed out in
Lauren,
your
sorry to
interview with
interrupt.
us, the financial sector is
Sorry, I think your audio is...
very,
Yeah. Oops.
We lost Lauren.
No.
Okay. She'll be back on soon. If you don't mind giving us a minute. Thank you for your patience.
Maybe as we're waiting for Lauren to come back on, Natasha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Natasha Garcha. I wear a number of different hats, but I think I'll be wearing two of them today. So one is I'm the Senior Director of Sustainable Finance at the Impact Investment Exchange, which is a women-led organization at the helm of sustainability and gender equality in financial markets. And the other hat I suppose that I'll be wearing is as an author of a book focused on gender equality and climate security, which is really underpinned by the Women, Peace and Security agenda to guide capital towards climate stress conflict areas in a more effective way, and also similarly to provide a framework that would be complemented by policymakers. So that's the context on which I'm with all of you today, and very, very pleased to be here. I think this was one of the most interesting surveys I've had the opportunity to participate in, and the study is really incredible. So I hope you all get the chance to dive into it. And it's so timely given everything that's happening with the world. So also wanted to thank the WIIS team and everyone involved actually for their efforts in bringing this excellent piece of work to the forefront.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm just thinking,
Okay.
I know Lauren's probably working on getting her connection back.
Yeah,
We
she
should
said
just
we can go ahead and proceed. So Natasha, if you want to start presenting, and then Lauren will join when she can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Natasha.
Absolutely. All right. Can you all see my screen?
yes.
Yes, we
Mhm.
can.
Perfect. Well, I'll dive right in then. In the interest of time, I think we'll try to keep this to about 10 minutes, but we have some time for Q&A after. Also, stop me in between if you need. I'm very happy to make this more of a conversation than a monologue. But I just wanted to take a step back and talk about two twin crises that the world is facing that are more interrelated than we may realize, and that's conflict and climate change. What you see here in the map is really a visual representation of what that looks like. The dark pink are the hotspots where you are seeing climate change is an active threat multiplier to war and conflict. And most of our wars, sadly, are either triggering an energy crisis, or they're being fought over water, and water is being weaponized. They're being fought over land. And all of this is obviously pressured by climate change, very similar in the dark purple areas and light purple areas. You're seeing a very strong correlation between these stress points of climate are aggregating issues with refugees. You're seeing this aggregate resource scarcity and other things that are eventually, unfortunately, leading to internal or, in some cases, interstate conflict. Now, while no one's isolated from this, and you'll see the light yellow parts are areas that are experiencing the spillover effects. And this map is a little bit old. And so I think the United States, unfortunately, would be all light yellow this year if we were to remap this. This is from a study I did a couple of years ago. But given the intertwined nature of this, one of I'm a data person, and so I ran a 10-year regression analysis as part of my research. And really what it was asking is, what is the greatest predictor of climate security? And feel free to drop your thinking in the chat, but I'll go right into one of the things that I ran first, which was religion. Does religion matter? And now most of you are reading the news, and so this is a no-brainer these days. You're looking at the war happening in the Middle East, and you're seeing the three key countries at that table all have three different dominant religions. So you're seeing Iran, Israel, and the United States. So it is not, religion is actually not a predictor of climate security, whether a state will or will not go to war based on climate. Latitude, similarly, not a great predictor. I'm calling from Singapore today, one of the greenest, most diplomatic countries in the world, and very much a tropical island. Democracy, somewhat a predictor, but can be unstable. There are some intense outliers. Again, all of you are reading the news, you know who these groups are. Wealth and GDP, and this is where it gets interesting for the private sector. This is one of the strongest predictors of whether you are climate secure, whether or not you would prefer to look for peaceful solutions to interstate problems when you're stressed by climate change. But the greatest predictor is gender equality. And this is just mind-blowing. This is a 10-year regression analysis looking at data from World Bank, Visions of Democracy, looking at UN data. And I think across about 146 countries is where I could get consistent data from. And the fact that this is there is for a few reasons. One is women, how you treat a penalty-free target at home is how you will treat people in foreign policy, right? If you feel someone is weaker than you, can be dominated, you will have the same behavior interstate. Now, what this leads to is, if you do a correlation analysis, what you're seeing here is high peaceful countries that are also low climate vulnerable. There's a clear correlation. But if you add a gender equality lens, you'll see that the countries that are the most peaceful and the most climate secure are also the most gender equal. This is not a coincidence, because even if you do it for the reverse, you're not just looking at states of war, which this axis looks like. You're looking at states of positive peace. Which are the countries that are most progressive, that are actually look for things that the private sector values? Good trade flows, stability, economic resilience. Again, when you map that out, and this is a particularly interesting graphic for private sector actors, you'll see that the low peaceful, the high climate vulnerable countries in the red quadrant are also the least gender equal. If you introduce gender equality, suddenly this data makes sense. This is not just a correlation analysis, it could be a causation analysis. This is the kind of reframe typically the private sector gravitates towards, in my experience, when you put it in economic terms of what this really means. And this is really the reframe that the book I just published focuses on. The term I use is the Athenian edge, really playing on the two great gods of Athena and Ares, who are brother and sister, both are gods of war. And while Athena wins with wisdom and strategy, Ares wins with brute force. And so both are ways to win in a case of scarcity, but one is looking for solutions towards peace. And I think the reframe for the private sector that I found most effective is that you don't position women as victims of war when you're going to them to incorporate peace and security agenda. You're talking to them about how, because women are on the front lines, they have unique wisdom, insights, and lived experiences that make them essential solutions for peace. Peace leads to security, to stability, to better investments, to more business opportunities. Wars are not won by brute force when you have gender equality, but by strategy and wisdom, because you're not fighting at all. You're looking for opportunities for cooperation, all the fundamentals of women, peace, and security, but you're reframing this in terms of what the private sector seeks. When you do that, here's a snapshot of the kind of data we use when we're trying to discuss these topics with the private sector. You will talk about, yes, on the one hand, 40% of the conflicts in the last 60 years were over natural resources, and these were the conflicts twice as likely to relapse. So why does it matter that women grow 70% of the food you eat, that they spend 250 million hours a day collecting your water, that they are the primary household energy decision makers because they influence adaptation and mitigation outcomes? Instantly, you have a connection between peace, climate, and gender, right? And this is an area that they would look at in silos, but suddenly when it seems more connected, they have a more compelling reason to think about, because I think they understand climate change better than they understand either peace or war or gender equality. But this is one of the reframes that we've used very effectively to help them wrap their head around why this matters and why this matters now and why this matters for their businesses. Asking them questions like, can you really afford to sideline the knowledge, the agency, the leadership of half the population when you're seeing climate shocks and conflict collide? Where does this leave your supply chains? Where does this leave your last mile workforce? Are your investments overseas safe in this interconnected world if you're ignorant of these kind of risks? And if climate change is a threat multiplier, shouldn't you be equally interested in gender equality as a stabilizer? And suddenly the peace and security becomes an asset for them, as the last presenter shared very eloquently. So this is really what led me to design the framework that's presented in the book. I think we have a separate talk on this coming up soon if you want to dive deeper, but it does map out across the 12 dimensions of climate change and states of peace and war. How would you create a framework that is really rooted in the principles of women, peace, and security, which focuses on prevention, protection, relief and recovery, and participation? How do you use that to design solutions that would break the silos between finance and policy? And those are really the areas within the realms in which the private sector would operate. They would look for the financial tools to support their businesses. They would look for the policy guidance to guide how they make operating decisions. And so this framework is just a high-level snapshot, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, dive into a couple of examples of what does this actually look like in practice. So I will spotlight one case study on orange bonds. So this is something I've personally worked on. Orange bonds, orange is the color of UN SDG 5, which is focused on gender equality. So you may have heard of green bonds, which focus on climate. Orange bonds focus on gender equality. So they're better suited for the women, peace, and security type of framing. Now, this is a snapshot of $2 billion that we've managed to mobilize in the last, I think, 18 months. I think we doubled down as soon as we saw certain countries stepping back from peace, gender, and climate in the global stage. And so we wanted to double down with an asset class that really makes sure that we are not relying only on aid funding for women, peace, and security and other things we wanted to support through the bigger orange movement. And one of the instruments that we wanted to tap into was the bond market. Bonds are a $1 trillion market. Green bonds alone have mobilized, I think, $5 trillion. It's massive. And so we wanted to use that kind of asset class for gender equality. One of the interesting orange bonds I'll spotlight is the refugee impact bond. This was done to support Syrian refugees, predominantly women. Women are from most of the refugees, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, who were settling into Jordan. And then how do you make sure that these, again, you're reframing to say these women are not just victims of war, they are solutions to economic resilience for Jordan as well, if they integrate them properly. So the Refugee Development Impact Bond was really launched in 2021 in Jordan to address the funding gaps that these women were facing it was a very, very unique structure in which you had funding upfront by IKEA Foundation. So you would take philanthropic funding by a corporate foundation who would have given this away as grants anyway, said, look, give us the upfront funding. We will prove that it works to invest in women, and they will actually create economic resilience in Jordan. And if those results are seen, you will have the Norwegian Agency for Development Corporation and the USDFC who will fund you back the capital. And then you can use that for more projects. Now, Norway and the United States had a political agenda here. They wanted to make sure there was more stability in the region, but they didn't want to provide the capital up front. So this is just an interesting mechanism where a number of stakeholders can come together to unlock capital from each other. So you will have policymakers and government actors play a role, but they can unlock capital from groups like IKEA to scale up solutions more quickly. I think what was really interesting about this is the commitment to results. So the mechanism was really set up that you only get paid back if results are achieved. So there's accountability. There was flexibility in the implementation. The outcomes for these women, of course, changed on a regular basis. There was very systematic ways to measure the impact, show the results, show the economic benefits, and then be repaid back your capital based on that. And it also led to a multi-year funding structure. I think what is very stressful for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is in a resource-scarce environment where every year you're fundraising. So much energy goes into fundraising. And I think what's the private sector is very good at is multi-year contracts. If they like something once, they can repeat that time and time again. So this is a good kind of structure that can be used for that kind of multi-year funding. Now, overall, if we want to bridge the gap, I think we have to break the gaps between finance and policy. In the interest of time, I'll go into more specific solutions for this group, and we can get into the rest on Q&A. But I think for policymakers, what we need, if you have policymakers in the room today, there needs to be an integration of this lens that is presented in the framework, where you have elements of climate and security frameworks that are already guiding private sector action, embed a women, peace, and security lens into those, breaking those silos with the right kind of disclosure requirements, incentive schemes on stock exchanges that I've seen have been very effective. Luxembourg Stock Exchange now does a gender tracking, which I think is very interesting. That's when you can see that businesses will be required to embed women, peace, and security principles into core strategy. So the easiest way to do this is obviously if the policymakers get behind it more systematically, rather than leaving it to a women, peace, and security national action plan, which is already underfunded. For capital providers, I would say the recommendations would be to recognize and reframe, as I said, talk about economic losses by 2100 will be 5 times the cost of action. So we need to make sure that we are acting today to avoid losses in the future. And I think most private sector organizations will understand the capital value and the business case for that. The private sector, again, if corporates are attracted to stability right now, and that is on the top of every corporate agenda. We just closed an orange bond last month, and I don't think people were even looking for a massive return on investment, but they were looking for how do you think about, when we were talking about the orange bond, how do we translate the peace dividends that come from women, peace, and security principles being embedded into a transaction, protecting your return on investments, just getting your capital back to you at the end of a tenor, rather than even thinking about crazy triple-digit returns that tech sectors and others promise. And I think we mentioned AI in the last presentation. I think it's imperative that we make sure capital providers, which are now using AI extensively to allocate capital, that you use the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is used to inform explainable and responsible AI tools. Unfortunately, AI remains very gender biased. I just ran a query for something else the other day. We're working on an AI Center of Excellence here in Singapore. And I said, oh, the CEO wants to say XYZ. And and AI assumed the CEO was a man. And I saw the whole draft was for men. And you can see the way the entire thinking of AI solutions, because they're mostly designed by men and for male-led private sector businesses, that they will be oblivious to these things. So I think one of the things capital providers need to be very conscious of is when you're using these tools, if they are built with those guardrails. And that's actually brings me to my last point, which is for the members on this call, I think the 3 decades of silos that we've seen between women, climate, and peace, ever since Women, Peace, and Security agenda started manifesting in many different forums, needs to end. The book that I've come out with really calls at the end of it for a community of practice, but you really already have that with what WIIS is trying to build. And I think this is the basis of a community that can share results, that can share solutions, and that can share pathways for action. We, through the Orange Movement, also have a lot of access to private sector participants, and we'd love to continue the dialogue with WIIS and others who are interested in how can we direct more orange bonds and orange capital towards initiatives you're doing for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So this is a call to action for myself on the Orange Committee, Orange Steering Committee, to see if we can deepen the partnership with any of you on the call who want to bring the private sector into some of the solutions you're doing. So I will leave you with that, olive branch, if you will, and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you for talking about the predictors and sort of the impacts of climate security. And I love the Athenian edge and a beautiful presentation. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Layla Hashemi. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships here at Women in International Security. I wanted to ask the group if you had any questions for our amazing speakers, Karin and Natasha. And I see one in the chat, I believe from Sophia. So Sophia says, thank you very much for the informative presentations. Just skipping ahead, Sophia's question asks, how do you differentiate DEIJ initiatives from WPS principles to the businesses? Would it be necessary to quote unquote disguise them as such for already open to DEIJ, or for those who have absolutely no leaning to DEIJ or WPS? What would be the best way to frame it so as not to confuse them? I see Sahana has raised her.
Well, I'll let Natasha go ahead and answer because I think the question was directed to her, and then I can come back in because I also have a couple of questions for Natasha myself.
Okay.
Sure. So I think, the terms that we're using these days are continuously being masked or reframed and other things. And I think I would always, with the private sector, or with, if you're thinking about looking at your question here, if you're thinking about businesses or corporates, I think it's the labels will always come and go, DEIJ, ESG, Orange, even, these are labels that are helpful for people who want a guiding set of principles. But if it's a first entry point, I would go back to the original framing of what are you even trying to fundamentally achieve? When we recently did an orange bond with a Japanese corporate, and we asked them, what their idea of orange is, and they're like, we're going to put a woman on the board. And we were like, okay, next month. And they're like, no, within 5 years. And so, you have people who are at that level who are so far off from this. So I think we spent a lot of time educating them on, we didn't even call it DEIJ, we didn't call it orange, we didn't call it anything. We said, look, one of your biggest supply chains is coffee. You're sourcing coffee from Guatemala. Coffee in Guatemala is grown by women. If you are gender blind, you are going to be completely blindsided when there are issues in this supply chain. They already had some worker-related retention issues and other things because women weren't paid a fair price. They obviously have different requirements than men in terms of safety. And without those guardrails, the supply chain was suffering. Making the business case was a lot easier when you just got down to the fundamentals, and shifting, again, suddenly the narrative was shifted from we have to save women through our CSR work to how do we recognize that these women are growing our most valuable produce? And how do we protect them from gender-based violence and from climate change and from all the other issues? And so suddenly then talking to them about women, peace, and security principles, such as women's participation in this particular case, became something that was a lot easier for them to digest. So that's my way of perhaps not confusing someone who this is very new for, is fundamentally bringing it down to why they should even protect these women in the first place and value them, not just protect them, but value them. They're not victims, they're not bystanders, they're your core stakeholders for your business.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And I believe, Sahana, you wanted to speak to this as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the messaging framing that Natasha gave is really excellent for knowing your audience. but I also really want to underscore this confusion or conflation of WPS with DEI was prevalent in the survey. And I think that's a problem because WPS is not DEI. It is not an HR issue. It is along the lines of what Natasha is talking about, which is outcomes, peace and security outcomes. And on top of that, WPS is actually legislation. There's actually a whole policy architecture and legislative framework, both globally and in the United States and in other countries. So that is very different than DEIA. I think also if we're going to use these terms, we have to really be clear about the definitions and the terms that we're using so that we don't veer off into non-productive discussions. So there's a difference between equality as an outcome and equity as fair practices. And WPS is about equality, and it's a transformational process that is never ending, right? We're always working towards that kind of transformation. In that vein, I am interested, actually, Natasha, in asking you about, you had mentioned national action plans and saying not to use them. But my point of view is because so many countries actually have not only the plans, but they have the internal processes of those plans, actually engaging private sector more in either the development of priorities in those plans with foreign ministries and development and foreign, funding, and also in the implementation of those plans, like twinning some aspects of national action plans with, for example, ESG or CSR types of activities. We have found that seems to be a really great open pathway to actually strengthen the policies and the legislation we have by doing these activities together. So I thought I wanted to ask you about that, and then kind of return to the AI question as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the point I was making is not to rely only on the NAPs, which are already stressed for resources, but to find other pathways and vehicles and instruments that are out there. And, why can't you use the bond to fund peace and security? I think that was more the point. But NAPs is actually something that I've also got in the framework. I think that's a tool that we have at our disposal that we must use more effectively. And I think what mostly I'm arguing in the book is that what we can't do is silo it off from the financing, because a lot of the work that I would do with looking at all the national action plans, when I would look at things that didn't get implemented, it was usually because there was no adequate financial resources for them to implement a certain initiative. So the policy was there, the will was there, they had the right kind of partners, and then you would see something drop off, and it was usually because of the lack of capital. And this, to me, as someone who's worked on Wall Street, just seems crazy because we know the capital is out there. Whenever anyone says there's no capital for this and there's no capital for that, that simply isn't true. We just have to find the right kind of financial mechanisms or policy incentives to unlock the capital. And I feel like that's why, I do think the green bonds, they have their issues. There's greenwashing, there's other issues, but they have managed to unlock $5 trillion. And I do think that's just one example, and why we try to then use orange bonds to say, okay, how do we also tap into one of the biggest capital sources out there, but we restructure them for our purposes, like a refugee impact bond is something that we want to fund. I do think national action plans, therefore, very critical. So completely agree with you. But I do think we have to make sure that the financing aspect is beefed up significantly. And why do we only rely on governments to do that? Why should the private sector, who is part of these problems, not also held accountable to solve them and through the Women, Peace and Security agenda?
Yeah, excellent points. I think if we could do a better job integrating, this is why we partnered with WIIS on this issue, is if we can do a better job of integrating the private sector into those women, peace, and security policy discussions, which they have not been, as many of us have said today, the private sector and the policy sector have been quite siloed. If we can integrate these ideas, for example, of orange bonds, and teach governments that this is an available avenue for them and give them the example. That's what, we want to be able to do that and promote that.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to continue this in the breakout rooms, but we have one more question. Prabha, I see your hand is up. Would you like to unmute?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so excited and I'm so sorry I missed the first few minutes. The question I have is how can we ensure that what you are sharing, Sahana is probably one of the people who's done the most to promote the women, peace, and security agenda for the last 10 years. I don't think I am stating when I say that. So I'm delighted to hear you saying, use the existing frameworks. You've been saying that for years. We've created them. There's legislation and there's a requirement that we use them. So it's not a choice. But Natasha, what you're describing is so very exciting. And I am embarrassed to say I have no idea that they were orange bonds. We have for the last year been highlighting the voices of Syrian women for policymakers and funders, and they have been very clear about where the investment needs to be. And it is landing nowhere in the private sector. We have initiated a private sector partnership where we are just simply introducing this notion of the impact of engaging and financing women's efforts, and not just women's efforts, but their recommendations, whether it's for youth or for women or for the larger population, right? We know that they are an early warning system as well as a critical part of the entrepreneurial efforts. And so I am really hoping that you can share a little bit more about how do we make these linkages? We're sitting here talking to the private sector, know the impact of financing women, no idea that there are mechanisms you're creating. And some of these are countrywide networks of people. And in none of the meetings, we had Scylla speak about making the business case for peace a couple of months ago, and nowhere is there a mention of this. So how can you help us with bridging some of these? And if I missed that in the first few minutes, forgive me, I will watch the video and catch up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, the private sector, depending on where the economy is, wants to either talk about all of this in terms of returns or all of this in terms of risk. And I think what we are, an unexpected skill set I have developed over the last decade is to position these opportunities in either frame. And so we're very happy to help with that kind of narrative building, because I think we've given up on trying to educate them on our language. We have educated ourselves on their language instead. Once you open the door, I think, again, like I said, it's a lot quicker. We've had some large investors buy orange bonds, Naveen, PayPal, MetLife, super funds from across the world. But the first few investors were folks like Rockefeller Foundation, so we're good at also how do you gradually open the door with the right groups. How do you use things like blended finance? I think that's really interesting. How do you make sure that you have enough buffers in there in financial instruments that make an investor feel safe to come in? So for instance, the bond that we just did, which is supposed to fund women, stability in the region, because Asia has been really thrown off by the war that's happened, and there's an energy crisis going on where I'm calling in from. And so we used support from the Swedish International Development Agency to guarantee our bonds, to say, look, if you think this is not, investing in women is just too foreign a concept for you, Sweden will guarantee the bonds. So if there's a loss, they will help protect it, but you give the upfront funding. And if there's no loss, Sweden doesn't have to do anything. And more often than not, there's no losses, because women are definitely your best bet if the world is going. I don't think we've ever had women defaulting on a loan because they gambled the money away or they drank the money away or these other issues that happen. And so even I remember when I was previously on Wall Street during the financial crisis, one of the best things you could have invested in was the microfinance industry. It was uncorrelated with other assets. Women are incredibly good borrowers. They're better savings. They're using the money to break cycles of poverty. It all means a lot more to them. And so during a time of crisis, the reframing is something that we've gotten good at. So very happy to continue the discussion on how to reframe to your audience, how to share examples of orange bonds from across the world, and not just bonds. Bonds are sometimes too much for people, but funds, loans, other kinds of vehicles as well.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you to Karin. Thank you, Sahana, and everyone. We're gonna head into breakout rooms. If that's okay. Oh, it's Sahana with your hand up again, so I didn't know if it was up from before.
Sorry, before we go to break, I just wanted to say, Prabha, what you brought up, first of all, thank you very much for the compliment. I did not do that single-handedly. There's definitely people like WIIS and a lot of other organizations on this as well. We're all in it together. But I wanted to just underscore here, this is the reason why we partnered with WIIS. Because exactly what Natasha is talking about and what Prabha is talking about is not just messaging and narratives, but bringing concrete examples like what Natasha is doing to our civil society, right, groups, because we don't know, we are not exposed to what the private sector is doing. So how could we know what to suggest to the private sector? And so our secure feature, this is why we want to do this, is having more of these conversations, I think, is the first place to start so that we actually know what we can bring to the table and how to talk to these actors. It's not that different than when we started in the security sector 20 years ago, and we had to learn the language of security so that we could translate what women, peace, and security relevance operationally was to them so that they would start thinking in human security terms. So I think we have to do the same thing with the private sector, which Natasha is helping us get a window into that. And probably you really flagged an important blind spot for us of we can do this. We can fix this. And that's what WIIS is, really doing beautifully here. So I will turn the floor over. Sorry, Layla, I had to get on my soapbox about that.
Thank you. All right, so next we'll move on to breakout rooms.